when the world goes into recession, who gets the most amount of sales? It's the entertainment industry. You can't rely on like just the experience of the external partners. Each company, each AAA dev, each AA dev that approaches them has their own methodology. Oh, you guys don't have a folder structure or a naming convention. Oh dear, this is going to be a problem.
Greetings and welcome to the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. In each episode, host Kirill Tokarev invites video game industry leaders to talk about the world of game development. No topic is off limits as long as it relates to video game development. New episodes are in the works, so remember to follow us or subscribe and share with someone you know will also enjoy the podcast.
Tell us a bit about your story. I mean, you've worked at CD Projekt Red, you worked at Rocksteady, you work at Deep Silver, like huge studios. How did you start? Like, how did you find your way from like a freelancer into doing all those gigs?
Started in the Philippines. I had a programming background, and I went into a multimedia school. And when I started outsourcing or game development outsourcing, maybe had a head start of about 2-3 years before I went into the industry. And at that time, there were only a handful of game outsourcing studios in the Philippines. One of them was called Lady Luck. And Lady Luck was one of the primary vendors of Naughty Dog. And they brought AAA to the Philippines and basically trained up a bunch of artists to start working on those games. So I joined one of Lady Luck specifically. And then from there, that became my launching point to like studying in Canada just to reinforce my knowledge. And then from there, I went over to Europe to CD Projekt, which back during that time, they only shipped like Witcher 2. So they were there, they had a presence, but Witcher 3 wasn't a thing yet. And I figured, you know what, let's try to live in Europe. So I ended up spending the next 5.5 years over there, actually, before I shifted over to Rocksteady. And then to Deep Silver, Fish Labs, and then now I'm here with Build a Rocket Boy.
There are new huge publishers being born in Europe, like Embracer, for example, which is kind of...
I mean, are they actually new? Because they've been around for a while, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering this industry since like 90s, so for me, they're pretty new. But
they seem pretty new, but they've been like just recently buying a lot of video game companies.
Definitely. So that's also one of the things that's kind of big in Europe, and I'm just trying to understand, like, from like because you live in the heart of it, right? You understand how they kind of operate. When you are there, how do you see this industry in the region? Not just in Hungary, but let's say when you go to European events, when you go to Gamescom, when you go to all those places, like, do you feel like it's expanding, shrinking?
It seems to be expanding in certain places. Like, definitely Poland. It's been erupting all over the place. Like, if I'm not mistaken, Infinity Ward is now there. Activision as well just recently opened up like a branch at the moment.
Do you feel like this is happening because of just a lot of talent that's there from like these big, like, People Can Fly and then Techland, and then there's...
It's CD Projekt, it's Techland, it's People Can Fly, it's 11-bit, and then all of those employees or all of that talent started basically spreading across Europe, but mostly centered in Poland because they have families there. And they don't want to leave because there's like this reasonable, should I say, like the cost of living is very affordable in those places. So why go? to another country where the cost of living is high, the salaries are okay, but it's not enough to sustain you in a way that you can still buy property and all of these things. So, yeah, I think that's why they want to stay.
So if we're talking about Poland, what are like the other big kind of powerhouse regions in Europe that are still making like AAA games?
I would say the UK is still on it. Yeah, the UK. There's only a handful, like in Germany, but hardly. I believe IO Interactive opened up in Barcelona, so that's starting. But I think it's actually quite in Eastern Europe right now. It's funnily enough, yeah.
Why do you think this happened? Because of the costs of production?
I reckon, yeah. It's the cost of production. I think they also have a pretty huge coder body in Eastern Europe, stemming from Ukraine, like Poland. And at the same time, they just don't want to go. They just don't want to leave. So what do? You move your company there if you want to soak up some of that talent.
Do you feel like talent is one of the main drivers sort of like for companies to go around in a new region? Like, is this like the main thing where they're doing it, or are there other things like, like we said, tax incentives, or maybe cheaper, I don't know, leasing space? Or
it's probably that also, like it's less complicated to set up shop over there, but I think the primary drive is talent.
So we kind of jumped into the European stuff, but so one of the biggest part of your career, you were working as an outsource manager. You were working a lot with external kind of development studio.
I started as in external development.
So we have a big question for you. So we work with a lot of people, right, who either it's small outsourcing companies, or it's even teams who are not really, they don't have like an LLC or anything, but they do want to sell their kind of skills and capacity to a client like Naughty Dog. That would be like a dream client for them. Mm-hmm. Or any big studio, let's say. From the perspective of a studio, since you worked in a lot of those, what do companies usually look at when they're making this decision to hire this extra help or not to hire? What are like the things that are super important in order to land the contract?
Usually there are three aspects that we look for in a studio that we'd like to work with. One is, of course, the talent, the portfolio, the track record, when it comes to like if they've had any other projects before, maybe from a AAA studio as well. Next one is if they have the IT capacity. So the quick internet speeds, if they have IT support to be able to plug into your Perforce, to your engine, and accommodate to all of the tools that you have and expose them to the people working in those companies. And then the third is to have a very reliable production team to support, because what's expected of an external team is basically to be self-sufficient to a certain degree and to be very communicative, especially in aspects that information that they may not have been fed to begin with or briefed with. So they have to be proactive with that, because sometimes the development studio won't be able to catch it ahead of time. So it is ideal that they would communicate with us and post us all of the questions anything that could possibly happen, basically, and to cover their ground.
So when working with, I'm going to tell you a story. So I think it was a long time ago, maybe like 10 to 12 years ago, like a large company in Eastern Europe, they were building a multiplayer online title, sort of like similar to World of Warcraft or something like that. stylized graphics, like a lot of assets, a lot of work involved, and they started to work with outsourcers. And at that time, there were also like a lot of those smaller teams, and of course they kind of ended up having a lot of problems with communication and bug fixing, tweaking models, and all this stuff. And what they did is they created this huge Bible, which was like 100 pages long, where they kind of step by step wrote all the mistakes that the outsourcer were making, and they were trying to communicate why this shouldn't be done or how it should be done, and kind of like that. Hopefully we've grown for the last 10 or 12 years, and now we have a better solution. So when you're kind of communicating with those teams, when you're trying to explain what you need, what are the main tools that you're using? Is it still like you're writing a brief and
you still write the brief, but you have to be introspective. So I was working with Rocksteady, and outsourcing or external development is a big deal. We were doing external development to pretty much the number of people that were the size of our studio. So it was like 270, 280. So it's a huge extension of the studio, and in order to be able to pull that off, you have to be introspective about your own workflows inside the company, and you have to be clear about that. So it's because I was working with a lot of leads, and normally we would have like a few months in advance to prepare for external development. So what we were doing is basically me asking the leads, all right, so what are you trying to make? Okay, I'm trying to make this. Now let's break it apart. And basically just breaking it down as if they were onboarding somebody internally for the first time. So what do they need to do? What's step one? How do you make a car or something like that, And I would poke and prod at the very beginning and ask all of the specific questions already to cover all of the ground. And then to accompany that is to figure out their workflow. How would your deliverables be like? What are the steps? What's the first deliverable? What's the second deliverable? What's the third, fourth, up to the final product? And break it down into, okay, so you're expecting concepts first? What kind of concepts do you want? Do you just want line art to begin with? And then once that gets approved, then we do a render? Because they need to know what they're expecting, up to what quality they're expecting. Only then will you be able to explain that to an external vendor. Because imagine you're trying to onboard 10 new people and they know nothing about how you work as a company. You can't rely on just the experience of the external partners. Each company, each AAA dev, each AA dev that approaches them has their own methodology. And you can make an asset in 20 different ways. So you gotta choose which one. And that's basically how you get it done. So it's not only setting up the correct Slack channels. Ideally, you have constant communication with them. You have to treat them in a way that they are somebody who is working in the same company. You need to be able to send them a message immediately if there is an emergency. They need to know if Perforce is locked. They need to know if they checked they need to check in their files now, because there will be let's say, they're gonna make a new build and then they want to secure it. You need to open up all of those lines of communications. Otherwise, you'll end up with, pretty much a nightmare.
It sounds like it's an incredible amount of paperwork and organization, and basically it's like increasing your headcount twice.
Yeah.
It's like hiring 100 people at the same.
It's exactly that. It's almost like just imagine, what if you had an internal team and you're going to expand it now, and they will be staying with you for the next 2 years. So the only real difference is that if you hire internally, when your project is done, when you ship, what do you do with those people? When you just suddenly expanded 100 more, but maybe you don't need it. So that's why you invest on external development, so that you can increase to 100 over the next 2 years, but don't necessarily have to worry about sustaining 100 for the next 10.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that it's kind of like a healthier way of doing business, where your core team is kind of there and you're taking care of them, but at the same time, if you need to scale a little bit, you can always rely on an external partner. And that brings me to the next question. Like, if you're playing any games and you are lucky enough to beat it and you see like the credits roll, I am right now almost scared of this moment, because I know that it's gonna be like almost 10 or like 15 minutes of just names going for like forever. And the question coming from that, in today's market, like if you want to do, let's say, a AA, AAA production, is it even conceivable that you can do something like that without using external development or some kind of art outsourcing?
Unless you minimize your scope, like into something really intelligent. Like the guys who made Valheim, for example, 5 people. Something that just sold 16 million in the first 3 weeks. That was thinking smart. So it really depends on what you make. When you go something like open world multiplayer, I don't know, city game in the future, blah blah blah, then you're setting yourself up for like a huge scope that potentially an internal team won't be able to accommodate for.
So when I talk with like other outsourcing companies, usually like their leadership, what they're saying is that in the current market, studios don't have capacity to do everything that they want to do. Like there is like no way in hell that like Sony Santa Monica or some other large company will be able to do like something like, I don't know, like Bloodborne or, you know, God of War or Call of Duty without kind of using external help. Do you feel overall, is this kind of beneficial for the whole video game industry, or do you feel like this creates an environment where bigger companies are making bigger products and smaller studios don't have kind of an opportunity to grow, and instead they kind of reserve to doing outsourced work? Because I know like a lot of those stories where
there are a lot of like smaller developers who start with external development. Like just, I have a bunch of employees right now. Yes, some of them are working on our internal project, but I am taking other contracts from other AAA developers to co-dev. Yeah, a lot of them start out like that. But yeah, in terms of AAA, I can't see any other way than actually utilizing co-dev.
Do you feel like in the future, with all the AI going on, with all the procedural stuff going on, and you mentioned that developers, when they think smart and they use the right tech, they can kind of lower the costs and especially the headcount when they're producing. Do you feel like this is in some way going to influence outsourcing? Is it like a substitute for outsourcing or not really?
It is possible, because like recently, I forget, what is that AI who is working on concepts right now?
Daddy or something.
Oh, that also. But there's also the other one.
Yeah.
Midjourney,
Yeah.
I think.
Yes, I was talking about it.
Yeah.
I know what.
It's a little bit crazy, but it's quite interesting that they are finding ways to basically generate unique concept art out of just textual information, and also plug in the art style of some known artist, or if not even some artist in ArtStation, and then it would be able to adapt. But you also have, let's say, Houdini. Back during the day when we were making Witcher, we were planting every single tree manually with a brush, so and rotating them. But nowadays, you can basically have all of those forests spawn based out of logic, setting up basically like, oh, is it going to be just a basin, or is it going to be up in the mountains? And with a bunch of rules, you could more or less craft a baseline to cover the whole map, and then customize it later on with a bunch of artists. So yeah, that is doing like probably 80% of the job already. So whether you need outsourcing for that entirely depends on your scope, because maybe 80% is still not enough.
Yeah, I kind of see kind of two directions there. Promise this is like the last question about outsourcing, but one of the examples I had is Ubisoft, and actually like Rockstar as well. They have so much money that they, like Rockstar, they just buy huge outsourcing companies in India, for example, and then you just work with them and treat them as like you said, like an extension of the team, which is like they are part of Rockstar now. There are like Ubisoft is also, but they're going from another angle. They're investing a lot in like R&D, and they're doing those papers on SyncGraph where, you know, AI controls whatever, how the characters work in Assassin's Creed. One of the most interesting example from this kind of line of companies that are trying to find a way out of this, where you don't want to spend extra budget, I think is Embark. I think they're in Denmark or somewhere, or Sweden. They are just crazy. Like, first of all, they hired all of the incredible Houdini guys. Then they hired a bunch of guys who are doing AI, and they're building a huge online multiplayer game about fighting giant spider robots or something. And they are AI systems. So basically, it's like you're fighting Skynet, because the robot and how he thinks and moves, that's AI. It's like neural network stuff. It's not just like you're a bunch of scripts and then it falls down when you put in a certain number of bullets in it. So, and every kind of leg has its own kind of breaking point, and if you destroy one leg, it still moves, but in the other way, and it's all generated by AI. So I'm wondering, do you feel like all this tech that's coming up, is it in any way a threat to like the human capital, the people who are working in the, because I mean, if AI is doing perfect animations, maybe I don't need, that many animators anymore. You know what I mean?
Now, it entirely depends, I guess, because there are two schools of thought when it comes to dealing with AI. One is, yes, let us utilize AI so there would be less work for humanity, but also feed them. Like, let's still keep paying them, but let's get AI to do most of the work. And then there is the other side where it's like, why do we need to pay them when the machine is doing it? Ultimately, maybe it's just me and my perception of the world, but I get the feeling that it would be the second, which is like, yes, let's develop AI to do 80% of the work and let's employ less. Yeah, that's how I see it, unfortunately.
What do you think all those people are going to do if DALL-E or whatever else takes
over?
Basically need to look for another job. Is it like what I'm trying to say, is it like in the next 5 years, or do you feel like it's just like beyond our life?
Well, there are a bunch of artists already who are pretty much like utilizing DALL-E and Midjourney where they have it create the initial set of assets, like concepts, and then from there they work and put them together again into a different, let's say, concept. So at the moment, what they're doing is they're using it to speed up their work, which is great. In the long run, I don't know if it would be able to do that, to push it further than that, where it actually doesn't need a human anymore.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, so talking about humans and their importance for video game in general, and talking about your career a little bit. So you worked as an art manager, right? In I think it's in Deep Silver. When we talk with artists, usually we understand very clearly what they do. Like environment artist creates environments like props, materials. What does art manager do? Is it more about the art, or is it more about the manager?
It's a little bit of both. Okay, so yeah, I'm in a slightly strange position because I used to be an artist, still am, but I'm very managerial. So what I generally do is I try to, at the moment, look for the pain points that artists experience, and I try to basically either figure out, like, okay, you got 500 tickets pertaining to the same problem. Maybe this actually needs to be impeded against a feature that we need to, and then I come up with the feature with the artist. Like, okay, what's the common denominator over these 500 tickets? It's this particular thing. I'm just going to be very vague about it because it could be anything. And then that's basically it. And then I try to dig up, like, okay, is it for tech art? Is it for code? Is it for some other department to help us with, you know? And it's basically that, or figuring out, like, oh, our tech artist just invented the new feature, and he's been inventing features for the past couple of years now that is undocumented, that only 3 people know about, in different aspects of the things that he's worked on. I think we should have him document this, record it in a video, probably drop it into somewhere in Confluence, and then spread out the knowledge and actually set up calls across various teams to be aware that this actually exists. Or in other aspects, it's like, oh, you guys don't have a folder structure or a naming convention. Oh dear, this is going to be a problem. How do we do asset tracking efficiently? How do we estimate how long the work is going to be if we cannot track what's done and what's not done? So a lot of it is like art. It's like the role of a lead in a way, but on a very technical but also managerial level, where you're trying to make it efficient in terms of, like, coordinating between interdepartmental teams.
So, like, the question that I got out of this one is, do you feel like these problems that you're just described, and I'm sure you can name many more, is this something that you have to struggle with when you're managing art teams, like creative teams, or is this just universal for any kind of teams? Because like a bigger question to build on top of that is, like, what does it take to manage artists? Like, how do you even do this? Like, that they are okay with you as a manager, and they don't get mad at you, and everybody's kind of, on the same.
I think it's also, at least for me, this is just my thing, is that as a manager, I need to think of myself as somebody who is not as their boss, but as somebody who needs to help them. Whether it's getting them focused on the things that they like doing, whether it's making sure that they feel like there is a direction in their career, or there is actually somebody out there who is actually listening to all of the issues, technical issues that they encounter from a day-to-day that has been blocking them, and making sure that the stakeholders or other departments are aware so that they could help. And I think with at least that, you can keep them happy, or at least get them to feel comfortable with you. It's that is how I see it. It's mostly like making them believe that you're there as an ally, not somebody who is there to impede them.
That's so I'm telling you another story, kind of when you're talking about an ally and somebody that's not a competition, but of course during development there are different situations, and let's say you have like an auteur developer who's like your art lead or just your game director, creator, whoever, like, and then I've been told like a number of times of those stories where like there's art department, everybody's like scribbling, doing their stuff, that suddenly he appears, walks around, sees some kind of like a robot or something, and then says the word like, I want this in metal, or I want this red, right? And of course one decision, there's like a bunch of other, like a ripple effect everywhere. And if it's good if it's about art, and God forbid it's about like game mechanics or something else. Like, how do you solve those situations? How do you make sure that the team is, that they're not throwing themselves out of the window and not feel like the guys who had to redo the Sonic the Hedgehog in the movie?
I think that's the role of middle management. That's the fun bit of middle management. It's like you're trying to shelter or keep everybody happy in terms of like the artists or the developers, but also it's like a lot of communication with higher up stakeholders, which is selling the vision as early as possible so that they could veto it as early as possible so that you could minimize the repercussions below. But of course, you can't stop that. Occasionally, they will come over and say, I want that to be like this now. Even if you're already going into this trajectory. And it's basically a balancing act of, how about this alternative? I could still make what you want happen, but here is an alternative solution that will probably cause less trouble for people. So it's basically inserting another option, hopefully, crossing your fingers, they buy into it. If they don't, well, you just have to book that into a milestone somehow.
Yeah, I think it's very important to kind of, I know it's a little bit of politics and kind of that kind of stuff, but me, like, I hate politics, especially like in companies. I thought that when you're in a company, this thing just doesn't exist. You're just like free of it. But like a couple of years ago, I read the book, like on Harvard Business something, and they're saying they're like black and white, saying that politics is like a necessary evil in every organization out there, and you do have to make sure that you're kind of going in this direction. No matter where you are, if it's like a small company or it's a big company, I think it's universal everywhere. Yeah. So, when you're talking about these visits from management into the trenches, let's say, when they were shooting movies like in the 70s, let's say, like Godfather, there was a practice at Paramount and any other big studios where they were showing dailies. Dailies is basically something we've shot during the day, and one of the anecdotes is that Paramount saw Al Pacino in Godfather during one of the dailies, and they were so unimpressed that they wanted to fire him. Do you ever happen to be during those moments where you're showing a build, or you're doing something, or you're showing like your key, models or environments, and suddenly you understand that they don't really like it? And when this arises, what do you do? Like, how do you make sure that nobody gets fired, that we continue to... Because it's super subjective moment, right? It's like that's what kind of can make or break the game. How do you navigate that?
Well, hopefully you don't get to that point. For me, it's more of just mitigation. It's like not getting to that point, which means constant communication, or finding ways to be able to clearly communicate. Because, like, for me, stand-ups may not be enough. Talking about things verbally may not be enough. Somebody might be half listening. You cannot. But like, I used to work before with a software called ShotGrid. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Yeah. So as an art manager or a head of a department which is very visual, I find it as a very, very good tool to show works in progress or to come up with playlists pertaining to art teams, because that way they can't just use their imagination and then reinterpret what you're doing into something that they think it's supposed to look like. But I think that is a very useful tool, at least for me, when it comes to showing production updates, because it's like, this is the tone of red that I'm talking about. It's not this, it's not that, it's this one. Just watch the video, And I could sit them in a meeting and just show them all of this progress, and then they could flag what they want, what they don't want, and I could negotiate in those meetings. So
my question was, when you talk a lot about communication, and this is something I feel like a lot of artists are struggling with. A lot of them are introverts. They don't want to take an extra phone call when somebody calls them, right? When you have juniors who are just starting out, or where you have people from just fresh out of school, what advice would you give them? What skills, apart from just, your technical stuff or your bass stuff, what should they work on in order to be kind of like a more efficient member of the team and kind of have a better, journey in the industry, not getting fired? Or
I think that even as juniors, or even if you're just starting out in the industry, you shouldn't just be focused on your discipline. There are more things than just being really good at your craft. Another aspect is it's always a threefold type of responsibility for me, regardless of what rank you are in a company. One is, yes, it's about your discipline. Second is your responsibilities to production. And it's not just like about meeting deadlines. It's not that. It's owning the content that you are going to make. Start thinking about repercussions of the things that you are making. Start thinking about like where it can be reused, or speed up other people's work, not just yours. And lastly is how to be a team player, because being a team player means opening up the ability to communicate with other people in about all those other areas, such as your discipline, such as the things that you can be efficient about. So for me, as a team lead, it's all about making sure that each individual within the team could potentially eventually take on a leadership role, no matter if they want to be a specialist or an expert in that particular field. And by empowering them to be a well-rounded individual, you can delegate more. You can delegate more responsibilities, because at some point, you're just going to be like, you're going to be in this industry for such a long time that you won't be a master of all of those intricacies anymore. You're going to be stepping back, and you won't be able to yourself be able to say, this is exactly where we should go. Sometimes you do have to delegate that to other people who are closer to the trenches, people who are closer to the work. And in order to be able to do that, you need to get them to think the way that you do. As a manager, as a producer, as a lead. So So, it's all about that. It's delegation. Making them feel like the work is their own and it is also their responsibility.
So that's actually an excellent advice for, I think, if you want to excel at any career, right? It's not just art or it's not just game dev. It's just you need to kind of, if you're there, you might as well try to figure out what you want to do, what's your next step and the next step. And I had this question in mind when we were chatting on Facebook, is that I've been playing games like for a while, and I still remember games that were like made in the 80s, let's say. And the big question that I have now is like, where are those people who are making those games? Like, where are the people who were making Duke Nukem like 3D, right? Where are those level designers? Where are those, art producers? Because it a game that was created like 30 years ago or something like that. What happened to them? Like, and the question is, do you feel like game industry is this place where only the young can play, and if you can grow to a certain level and then you need to look for something else? Or do you feel like this is a place where you can build your entire career and still be, super successful and continue to make games?
At least from what I've seen so far, there are some which actually left the industry altogether because they got tired of it. But there were others, many others, actually more people that I know, who decided they'd just set up their own. Because they got tired of working for other people and they wanted some sort of a better financial security for themselves. They wanted a little bit more independence, so they set up their own shop. And that's so far what I've seen.
That's one of the very popular kind of decisions to make for a game developer, and we see that's why this industry, the new studio pops up almost like every week you open up, there's somebody invested in something. It feels like this is, and feel free to contradict me and interrupt me. It feels like this is a huge benefit. Like, even if you compare it to, we had this example with The Godfather. That actually did not work in film, where I think it was Coppola who created United Artists brand, and he wanted to build, filmmakers for filmmakers. We'll create our own movies, and there is no studios gonna rule us, and we'll find our own money. And eventually they all went bankrupt, so it didn't work out. With games, it seems that like Valheim or like PUBG or Epic may not be the perfect example because they were since forever, but there is this potential for a hit to come up out of nowhere. And let's look at the indie market, or a game like Stardew Valley. There was one guy slaving on it. He was driving this shitty Toyota Corolla from the 1980s, and that's all he did. But millions of copies sold, huge hit. Nobody even remembers Harvest Moon anymore. Everybody's playing just Stardew Valley. So it's reinvented the genre. So do you feel like this nature of video game developers, they want to go and build their own shop? Do you feel like this basically means that games are gonna continue on and on and on, and they will outlive Netflix and studios and metaverses and whatever we have in the future? Or maybe there is some caveat and eventually they're going to go down?
I think it's going to live on. It's funny when you think about it. When the world goes into recession, who gets the most amount of sales? It's the entertainment industry. It's a method of escape. So I think it's going to continue. I'm not worried about it ever going down, unless somehow AI starts making its own fun games and finds the recipe to humanity's happiness. But until then, yeah.
so far, like you mentioned escapism. I think it's a very big point here. Like my hobbies are probably reading and games, and at some point I figured that I stopped watching movies altogether, because there's very little kind of interaction, both like mentally, physically, or emotionally, or something. Like when I'm reading a book, I kind of figure out what the character does. It's in my head.
Yeah. Well, because it's with movies, it's somebody else showing you their vision. Whereas when it's books, it's up to your imagination on how these characters look like, how this world looks like, how it feels like. You fill in the blanks a lot. And with a book, you make it your own vision, so to speak.
And with the game, even though it might be super directed, it's super scripted, there's still this feeling that you are in control.
Yeah, it's an illusion of free will.
Yeah. You're going through this on your own with all the, and don't get me started on multiplayer games or very good, very well designed games like the Soul series, for example, where these situations, they occur out of nowhere. They've never been scripted, but the rules work in a way where it's kind of there. So I guess it's a good way of saying that if the games are gonna continue, we'll still be able to find work there, whether it's with AI or not with AI, and to quote Sviatoslav from yesterday's, that yes, AI is there, it's sort of like a substitute, but at the end of the day, at least for now, it's one of those tools that can help you build stuff faster, iterate faster, achieve results that you want to achieve in a quicker manner, and it's not something that you should, ignore like a ostrich, just put your head in the sand, and it's something to embrace, I guess, in general, right? All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I really
Thank you.
Thanks for enjoying another episode of the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. Check out upcoming episodes on the 80 Level website at 80.lv. Join our career site at 80.lv/RFP. And share our podcast with friends and on your social networks.